Welcome back to another episode of Wrong Sports. This time, I'm going to be doing another episode of Discontinued. And Discontinued remembers the college football programs that are no longer with us or in their original form. And this episode, I'm going to be going down to Florida to go over a program that was so good and became really famous in just a short time that they hit those high of heights and then they went away so quickly. This is the story of the University of Tampa Spartans and their football program that was one of the rare college football teams in the hotbed of Florida to go extinct. But before I get to the University of Tampa and their Spartans program, make sure you check me out on Patreon. I'm going to be having a link at the bottom of the screen, or just search Wrong Sports on Patreon. You can help out the channel there. Also, subscribe to the channel. Please ring the bell as well so we can give you updates on when I'm dropping new videos, and I'm going to be trying to drop new videos every other week. Also, check me out on Twitter at Wrong Sports, and leave me a comment on this video and tell me what other programs you want me to cover, or just other ideas of things you want me to cover on this channel. But the University of Tampa opened as a junior college first in 1931 before becoming a university by 1940. The school worked quickly on expanding the campus and also by creating a football team. The team was created shortly after the school started in 1933, after the university's first president, Frederick Spalding, wrote a letter to Nash Higgins, asking him to become the athletic director of the sports program and also start a football team. Now, I mentioned Spalding, I mentioned him because he was a former high school principal at a local Tampa school, and the football team at that school was also quite good in the 1920s, and they even won a Florida high school title, and the coach of that team was, yes, you guessed it, Nash Higgins. So obviously you are understanding the connection here. By the 1930s, though, Higgins was no longer at the Tampa high school, and he was actually an assistant at Florida under Charlie Backman. Backman had some great teams, and Higgins looked like he was going to get the Florida job. Instead of Higgins getting the job, he was passed over for Dutch Stanley. And Higgins, seeing that the Tampa coaching job and athletic job was open, he went to Tampa. And Higgins got to work quickly with a brand new team and school, basically. The school was very small, and their only place to play for the first few years was a community field in Tampa called Plant Field. They didn't play there long as they got a new stadium in 1937 called Phillips Field. Phillips was a nice stadium in the 1930s, and a stadium that could hold 20,000 people, which was a pretty big thing back then. With the new stadium, they also got their new colors and uniforms, which were all picked by Higgins, which were red, black, and gold, and really helped the team stand out for decades to come. Higgins would get the program started through the 1930s and was pretty good considering this was a brand new college. They won 36, 39, and 5 before he would step down from his dual role just at the start of the 1940s. And when Higgins left, the 1940s brought them a lot of change at the campus on the University of Tampa. The changes were that they had a new coach pretty much every year, and along with that, they didn't really play half of the decade. The reason for the changes at coach and the minimal schedule was because of the war, and also due to the campus becoming more of a training school in the mid-40s. Now, if you have watched my series on service college teams, which I'll put a link above, then you will know that dozens of universities and colleges all over the US became training grounds for the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. Now, not every school was a training site, but if you were, you sometimes reaped the benefits of having the extra soldiers and the extra men on campus, as you could field a better team, as it would happen to some, but didn't happen to others, as Tampa didn't reap the benefits of it, as they wouldn't have a coach or an athletic director, and went without football for the 43, 44, and 1945 seasons. And just before the war in 1942, they were actually not that bad as they went 5-5 and gave Florida a game to start their season. After the war, though, in 1946, they only played a few exhibition games, then took the 1947 season off before coming back in 1948 with a new coach. His name was Mike Gaddis. And Gaddis would win only 2 games in 1948 before completely falling apart in 1949 as they went 0-8 and they lost by a margin of 2 touchdowns or more. The only thing of note that happened during this time in the 1940s was that they started playing a new school that also started their football program in the 1940s in Florida State, and they would play them for the next decade or so. But after the weird 1940s and losing a lot of games, the school was looking for a change and they wanted to go with something going big. And they went with someone big as their next coach in Heisman winner Frank Cinquich. Cinquich would take the job in March after signaling some interest in it and got to work in early April. Now, Cinquich was a college football Hall of Famer at Georgia and won the Heisman Trophy and national title in the same year in 1942. After he played a few years in the pro and also had some injuries, he started coaching. But it was only for 1 year as he coached a semi-pro team. So he was coming to Tampa looking for success. Cincwich's team to start in 1950 wasn't so great as they were coming in with an 11-game losing streak. But they did manage to win their first game of the season, which was a great start. After that, though, they would win 4 out of 5 games in the middle of the season over actual colleges instead of just service teams or smaller colleges, and they would end up with a 5-4 record. So it was their first winning season that I could find. Again, I could be wrong, but the 1950 season was the first one I could find. The 1951 season was the first full season with Cinquich at the helm, as he was able to get spring practice in, and it was looking good to start with a big win over a local Air Force base. Then they went on the road to lose badly to Bradley before they traveled to Wofford. At Wofford, they had a 14-7 lead at half, but Wofford came back to hand them their second loss. After this rough start, they went 5-1-1, including a big season finale upset win over Florida State, a team they still hadn't beaten after 3 tries, and their final record was 6-3-1. The final win also helped the team get their first ever postseason invite. This wasn't a bowl game, so to speak, but basically an after-season exhibition game to play Brandeis in the Brandeis Classic in Miami. The trip was much closer for Tampa than Brandeis, and Tampa showed off their quick feet first as they scored first in this game, and that would be all they would need as their defense, which had given up an average of 12.5 points per game, didn't give up anything in this game, and they won 7-0. Even though the game wasn't a bowl game, it was still a big game for them, as Brandeis was the first school from the Northeast that Tampa had faced. Cinquich gave the school their best season at 7-3-1, and after the season in late March, he would say goodbye to the school and start to work in private business, never coming back to football. After Cinquich left Tampa, Tampa would do what a lot of schools in my Discontinued series have done, and that is hire from within. And they would hire their line coach to be their next head coach in 1952, Marcelino Huerta. Huerta was a child of Cuban immigrants and was in the U.S. Army during World War II and was almost captured behind enemy lines, but he managed to make his way back to the base. After the war, he went to college at the University of Florida and played guard from 1947 to 1949, and then he was hired quickly as an assistant at Tampa. Huerta was hired not only due to him already being there, but also because he was a graduate of a high school in Tampa, so he knew the area. And along with a head coach, he was also AD, making him the first NCAA football coach and AD of Cuban descent. And the first season under Huerta was a good one, and they even beat Florida State again at the end of the season on the road. The season ended with their first ever bowl game, which was the Cigar Bowl, which was one of the first few bowl games or postseason games for small colleges. The game started in 1947 and was played in Tampa in Phillips Field, yet up to this point, the Spartans were never invited or accepted a bid to this game. They would go this time, and they played only 1 week after the win over Florida State, and they faced Lenoir-Rhyne, beating them and capturing their first bowl win. The next season they took a step back, but they still had a 500 record, going 6-6, losing to Florida State and ruining their shot at 3 wins in a row over them. But their biggest win was an early November win over East Carolina, as East Carolina was on a 14-game winning streak. Even though they were 500 in 1953, they went up the next season, going 7-1. But just before they were going to accept another Cigar Bowl bid, they suffered their second straight loss to Florida State. The loss didn't hurt their bowl bid, and Tampa won their second Cigar Bowl and gave Huerta his first 8-win season. The next few seasons resulted in an average of 6.5 wins, and even though they didn't go to a bowl game in any of these seasons, they were still drawing fans. They were also still competing against their in-state rivals like Florida State, but after those wins at the beginning of the decade, they couldn't beat them again as Florida State got a whole lot better into the late 1950s and early 1960s. The Spartans and Huerta finally hit a wall in 1959 as they won 3 games, then went to 2 wins in 1960. The 1961 season was their 25th season for the program, and they rewarded the school and Huerta with an 8-1 season, and the defense giving up 10 points per game, which was one of their best defensive seasons. After the season, Huerta seemed to reach his heights at Tampa, and he would move up to Wichita State to take the same jobs there. This put Tampa in a spot that they weren't in since 1952. It's been about 10 years since they were looking for a coach now. And once again, to hire a new coach, they hired from within, as they hired Fred Pankos. Pankos played in the mid-1950s, and then he was an assistant under his coach, Coach Huerta. Pankos was only 30 when he took the job, and he was looking to make Tampa into a big-name school. Unfortunately, he couldn't do anything with the talent there, and they went 3-4-2 in his first season. But going into 1963, Pankos would do something that the school wouldn't be a fan of later on, and that was scheduling a game versus Ole Miss. The game was scheduled for November 9th in Ole Miss, and Tampa would come into the game 3-3-1. And well, the game didn't go so good, as Ole Miss ran all over them and they had a top-notch SEC defense, shutting them out 41-0. Pankos finished the season 4-5-1, but he was looking to make this program a big-time program with the scheduling of Ole Miss, and pushed for the school to make this program a Division I school. The school officials, though, at the time thought it was nuts and didn't think too much of the idea, which annoyed Pankos, and he would eventually resign at the end of the 1963 season, going 8-3 at the school, and he would end up being an assistant at Florida, and he would eventually coach the D1 level as he became a head coach at Memphis State and Vanderbilt. So with the resignation of Pankos, the school was looking for a new coach quicker than they thought they were going to have to look for one, and again, they went to the sidelines, their own sidelines, to find their new coach in Sam Bailey. Bailey was a longtime assistant under the last two coaches, and he actually played at Georgia during the same time of Cinquich. So that might have been why he was hired to Tampa in the first place in 1950. His first season in 1964, he started with a 5-game losing streak, including getting shut out twice in those 5 games. But he did manage to turn it around to a 4-6 record. The team would have a winning record in 1965 as they would win 6 games and also schedule SEC team Mississippi State. They would lose badly in this game again to another SEC team, but at least they would score in this game. So with the team flying high off a winning record the previous season, they would come into 1967 under head coach Sam Bailey and got some changes. Their big change would be that they would play in a brand new stadium, as the city of Tampa would build the brand new Tampa Stadium opening in 1967. Along with the new stadium, the city was trying to get a pro team, and the university was starting to become the city's team, so they would start playing in the stadium, drawing big crowds. So 1967 was going to be a big year for them, as Tampa scheduled a new team to start the season as they would play Virginia Tech, and then scheduled number 3 Tennessee to play as their first game in the brand new Tampa Stadium. Unfortunately for them, these 2 games didn't result in wins, but with the new stadium, they were able to draw 25,000 fans or more per game, and the team did end with 2 wins in 1967, and then they would have to go out looking for a new coach. And instead of looking from within, they went outside looking for a new coach, as they would hire former Miami quarterback and assistant coach Frank Kersey. Kersey was a well-known player in the area since he played in Miami, and this was his first head coaching opportunity, and he took it in stride, as the 1968 team would start 3-0, beating teams like Akron and Tulane, and the team would have their biggest game just before Halloween, as Mississippi State would come to Tampa to play the Spartans again, and this time, the Spartans got the upper hand and won, giving them their first win over an SEC team. Tampa was now 7-1 before they dropped their final 2 games to be 7-3, but the team was becoming very good, and they were now drawing 15,000 fans or more for their games this season. So you may have noticed that the schedule has changed a bit, with more Division I programs making the schedule. Well, that was because in 1967, the school announced that they would be moving up to Division I in 1971, which was only 8 years after their previous coach tried to push them for it. Another thing that would happen in the 1960s was a very good thing, like integration, as they would give out their first scholarship to a black athlete in 1967, as they gave a scholarship to Leon Mcquay, and he would play for them in 1968. Along with that great thing, they also had a great season in 1969, going 8-2, including having 4 shutouts. Their only losses this season was to Akron in Week 1 and losing their finale after a last-minute comeback failed to Florida A&M. But they were starting to show that they could compete against better competition, and it was mostly because they were using a lot of transfers too. Now, if you happen to not know what a transfer is, it is something that happens almost every day in college football. You always hear about someone transferring from a school, but it allows for a student athlete to play at another school with their eligibility remaining. Now, there was one big thing about the transfer and eligibility. Since Tampa wasn't in the college-university division, which was Division I until 1973, since Tampa wasn't technically in that yet, the transfers that they got didn't have to sit out a year, as they would if they transferred to a school in the university division. Now, not all conferences lived by this transfer rule, but most did, and if you were a school with transfers, and you didn't have a student athlete sit out a year, which you had to do if you transferred, like I said, then some of those schools in Division I wouldn't play you because they would say that those students were ineligible, so they would either say, sit out those students who are ineligible, or they just wouldn't play you altogether. And remember this situation because it would come up to Tampa in the 1970 season. And the 1970 team was probably the best Tampa ever had in their first 34 years of this program, because they had a great defense, as well as Mcquay at running back, who was coming back for his junior year. After his first 2 years, he ran for over 1,600 yards and 15 touchdowns. And this season, they would start wrecking teams as they went 4-0, scoring an average of 29.5 points per game, only giving up 8 points per game in those first 4 games. Their biggest game of the season would be coming up in Game 5 as they would play Miami. It was against Kersey's former team, and a team that Tampa could rarely beat. The game was in the Orange Bowl in front of 30,000 fans, and Miami was coming in this game off of a few down years, but this year they were looking pretty good as they were 2-1 coming in. And well, this game was pretty much all Tampa, as Tampa pinned Miami behind their own 20 for most of the first quarter, and then they scored 3 touchdowns on top of that. Miami would eventually score, but Tampa was in full control of this game pretty much the whole way, and they would end up winning 31-14. The win made Tampa 5-0, and they were also ranked number 1 in the college division poll. The ranking would stay number 1 for the next few weeks, as they would put up an average of 41 points per game, so now with Tampa 9-0, they would come back home to play Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt was an SEC team, and remember, I mentioned those transfer rules because they are really important here. Since Tampa was an independent school, they didn't abide by the transfer rules, and Vanderbilt was playing this game under SEC rules. It was agreed upon. Since that was the case, Tampa would have to sit out 5 players of their team due to those players not sitting out a year after transferring. 3 out of 5 of those bench players were defensive starters, with one that I will mention. The player was Sam Gellerstead. He played defensive tackle and was on Alabama the previous season before transferring to Tampa. He played really well on Bama, stuffing the line, and he also had 25 tackles in a game versus Vanderbilt in 1969. So that was pretty much looked at as a main reason for Vanderbilt not wanting to play this guy. Kersey was annoyed that he was forced to bench these players, but he went with it as he was confident that his team could still pull out a win here. 35,000 fans showed up to Tampa to see this game, with Tampa falling behind 12-0. With Spartan fans worried, the team battled back, outscoring Vanderbilt 28-8 through 3 quarters and taking a 28-20 lead going into the 4th quarter. With an undefeated season in sight though, Vanderbilt would break their hearts, scoring twice in the 4th quarter to take a 36-28 lead, and that would end up being the end of the game. Kersey was not happy after this loss. Tampa would end this season with another win and end this season 10-1. So it was their best season, and the best player on this team was Leon Mcquay, who followed up his freshman and sophomore seasons by running for 1,362 yards this season and scoring 22 touchdowns. There was no bowl game, unfortunately, for Tampa this season, but something else big would happen, as in January, Frank Kersey would leave Tampa and head to the other side of the state to take a job at his alma mater, the University of Miami. So after their biggest season to date, they would be going into a new season looking for a new coach and also being a Division I team. Tampa again would look outside the football football program for their new coach as they would hire the line coach for Florida. His name was Bill Fulcher. Fulcher was a player at Georgia Tech in the 1950s under Bobby Dodd, and he would also be an assistant under them too. Fulcher was stepping into a school that had a great team, a good stadium, and now a really good schedule. But before I start with the 1971 season, I have to mention two very noteworthy players that you'll probably be hearing a lot about this year and probably the next few seasons. Their first player was on defense, and he was getting a reputation at this point as he was a great defensive lineman. His name was John Matuzak. He was a former All-State shot putter in Wisconsin before going to Missouri. He would play one season there at tight end, but he didn't get a lot of playing time. And after Missouri changed coaches, his scholarship was revoked and he came to Tampa. At Tampa, he would play defensive lineman and he would wreck teams in the 1971 and 72 season. While he was running the defense, running the offense was the fast running back Freddy Solomon, who came to Tampa to be a running back, but he would also be a wide receiver at times and a quarterback at times too. And behind these two players, Tampa was looking to be as good as they were the previous season. But unfortunately, they would hit a speed bump to start their season as they would lose to Louisiana Tech. After that, they would rattle off 4 straight wins, mostly to smaller schools, before they would play some big-time teams coming up in October and November. The first of those big-time teams was Vanderbilt, which they would lose by 3 points, before they would play Ole Miss at home. The game was tied 21-21 late in the second half, before Ole Miss made it 28-21. Tampa would though make a late drive and score to make it 28-27 and go for 2 points, but miss it, and Ole Miss would escape with a win. Those 2 losses, no matter how close, were 2 of 5 losses this season, as they would end 6-5, not beating any of the big-time schools that they scheduled this year. After that end to their first D1 season, they had to look for a coach again, as Fulcher went back to Georgia Tech to be the coach, so Tampa went out to hire Earl Bruce. Bruce was a longtime Ohio high school coach, as well as an Ohio State assistant for the last few years, so the hire was looked at as a good one for this talented school, and they got off to a hot start in 1972, going 3-0, including shutting out Toledo, who were coming off going 3 years undefeated. They were on a 35-game winning streak, which is something I'm going to be going over in a future episode of my deep dive series, so stay tuned for that. But anyway, they shut them out 21-0 to start the season, so that showed how good Tampa was. After that, they went to Manhattan, Kansas to play Kansas State, who weren't at the bottom of the barrel just yet, as they were 5-6 and 6-5 the previous 2 seasons, and the game was not an easy one for Tampa, as they struggled, as Solomon was not able to do anything for Tampa, and they lost 31-7. After that loss, they would come back home to play Louisville. And Louisville was very good, as they had winning records over their last 3 years, including a Missouri Valley Conference title in 1970 under their coach Lee Corso. Yes, Lee Corso from ESPN. Louisville were a great team this year with a good defense that outlasted Tampa, as the game went Louisville's way late and Tampa lost 17-14. The 2 losses were looking like it would start a streak, but then Coach Bruce and the team fought it off and they wouldn't lose again for the rest of the year. Tampa would rattle off 6 straight wins, all at home, and notable ones were a 7-0 win over Miami, with the former coach Kersey at the helm, and then also beating Vanderbilt 30-7. The Vanderbilt win was especially sweet, as it made up for their loss the previous season, as well as make Tampa 9-2 and get them invited to the Tangerine Bowl. With this invite, Tampa was officially invited to their first bowl game, which pitted them against MAC champions Kent State. And Kent State this year were coached by legendary Washington coach Don James, who would also have legendary linebacker Jack Lambert playing, as well as Gary Pinkel on the defense, and present Alabama coach Nick Saban as well on the bench. The game started quick for Tampa, as they would score on 2 touchdowns in the first 8 minutes of the game, with both touchdowns being caught by wide receiver / running back Paul Orndorff. If that name doesn't ring a bell, well then you might not know pro wrestling all that well, as he made a lot of money and was quite famous for his pro wrestling escapades in the mid to late 1980s, and RIP to him because he recently just passed. After that, Tampa would get another touchdown by running back Freddie Solomon to make it 21-0, and then they spent the rest of the game pretty much holding off Kent State to win this game 21-18. The game was in front of 20,000 fans, and it made Tampa a household name going into next season. But But once again, before I get to next season, I have to talk about a coaching change, as Earl Bruce would leave Tampa to go to Iowa State to take over the job there, and Tampa was going to be hiring their 4th coach in the last 4 seasons, and went inside the program this time in hiring their defensive coordinator to head coach. His name was Dennis Friesel. Friesel made sense, as the defense was the star of the program over the last few years, but unfortunately they wouldn't be bringing back their best defensive player, John Matuzak, as he was drafted number 1 overall in the NFL draft in 1972, and he has an insane story, his pro career, as well as being an actor, whole bunch of stuff he did. The 1973 season, though, was kind of like 1972 as they started at 2-0, but then faced Kansas State, this time at home, and then they would lose to them again. So they just couldn't beat Kansas State. That was like the team they just could never beat. After the K-State loss, they retaliated with a 5-game winning streak, and they were 7-1, but then they lost in a last-minute comeback to Chattanooga, and then traveled to Vanderbilt to lose badly to them, and thus didn't get their SEC win like they did the previous years. But their final game was basically a bowl game, because they would play Rutgers, and Rutgers would travel to Tampa. Tampa would easily get a win in their finale and close the season 8-3. The 1974 season would start differently from the other ones because their coach would actually stay around, and they still had Freddy Solomon, so that was good. The season started on the road with a brutal schedule that had them go to Chattanooga and Toledo and San Diego State in consecutive weeks. That is quite a travel schedule. And then they would come out of that going 2-1, only losing to San Diego State by 3, but the travel may have gotten to them as they played them last. Coming back home, they played Miami, who were ranked, and they were 2-0, and the game was close like usual, but Tampa fell short, losing 28-26 in front of 40,000 fans. It was one of the most attended games over the last 3 years for them. Now at 2-2, they would go 500 over their next 6 games, beating teams like Villanova and Akron, but losing to Tulsa, West Texas State, and finally their homecoming game November 23rd versus Southern Missouri, which saw the field get struck by lightning, and then Tampa coming out to a 10-0 lead, only to see them lose 11-10. So yeah, the weirdness of that game led to their season finale versus Florida A&M, and Tampa was able to win and end the season with another winning record, giving them 7 in a row. A big reason for the winning record, though, was Freddie Solomon, who played running back mostly, but also quarterback at times this season. He rushed for 1,300 yards and 19 touchdowns. But after the season, the news that you pretty much knew was going to be happening eventually, but the players and coaches didn't know at the time, and that was the team was going to be discontinued. The reason was financial, as the school did an overview and found that the school lost $170,000 starting from the 1971 season, and that the school did a projection to find that if they played 1975, they'd lose over $200,000, and if they played 1976 and 1977, they would lose $400,000 a year. Plus, on top of the money that they were losing, the school took out $750,000 from their endowment to pay for the team when it moved up to Division I in 1971, and this team was not a rich school. Along with these findings, there was a push from the faculty that called for the school to finally get rid of the football program, and get rid of it immediately, as it was a money loser. In addition, according to a St. Petersburg Time article in 1975, the school wasn't graduating student athletes either, as 24% of football players graduated, which wouldn't be a problem if they kept playing, as that usually led to probation and other NCAA violations. Several players on the team, like Leon Mcquay, would leave school early after their junior year to play in Canada or other pro leagues, so that might have contributed to the low graduation rate. Another big reason was that Tampa wasn't drawing big attendances to their games at Tampa Stadium. And also, coming up in 1976, Tampa Bay was going to be getting their first ever professional football team in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Even though the Buccaneers weren't good, it was pretty much the death knell for any other professional or college football team for the next few years in the city. Dennis Friesel, though, was caught completely off guard as he had a 3-year contract at the school, so he was paid for another year, but none of his assistants were. So the school would honor his contract and also honor the scholarship student athletes that weren't freshmen. So at least they did that, but the assistants were SOL. The school only had 2,000 students at the time, so a move to Division I wasn't really the smartest move. Plus, it's also tough too when if you're already in debt and you just continue being in debt, it's really tough for you to keep your football team around. So I totally understand them dropping the football program, but it just sucks because this team was so good, especially that 1972 team, which had Matuzak and Freddy Solomon. They were just so good then. Their final record was 197, 160, and 12, but they were undefeated in bowl games like other teams that I've gone over in this series. But anyway, I hope you liked this episode. Again, make sure you subscribe to my channel. Please ring the bell as well at the bottom. Make sure you like this video. Make sure you share this video. Make sure you subscribe to my Patreon. I put a link at the bottom. Help out the channel, please. Any help you give me is greatly appreciated. Leave me a comment. Tell me what other teams you want me to cover in the series, and have a great day.